I try to be observant about what people are saying, asking, thinking in our realm when it comes to addiction, psychology, and the kinds of questions from lay people and I think professionals alike that I have been hearing are something like, well, we talked about Andrea Elliott, is that her name, who wrote Invisible Child? No, it's Andrea Elliott. Elliot Aronson is the guy.
Oh, Andrea Elliott. Okay.
Invisible Child.
The woman who wrote about the hidden child.
Yeah. So she wrote a thing. I don't remember if it's her article or what, but she said something about the alphabet soup of systems that people are just sort of like, it's a whirlwind of systems. They don't communicate with each other. And so we wrote a book called Outgrowing Addiction with Common Sense Instead of Disease Therapy. To actually live by what we wrote in our book, you would have to have a common sense way of dealing with people when it comes to addiction in the world, in your own life. And sometimes that's hard because the answers that you're given about, well, what do I do with this person who's addicted? What do I do with myself? I have an addiction experience that I'm trying to regulate. Is, well, there's this agency and that agency or this agency. And maybe if you're lucky, all the agencies will work together. And it's not that people are averse to the idea of the common sense thing. I think a lot of times it's that, how does that work? How does the common sense thing actually fit together, especially if there are a lot of players in this thing? And so I couldn't help but to try to pull that together and see if we could come up with some kind of answer to that, because people are asking about it all the time. So specifically, okay, I'm a person who's experiencing addiction. What's my role? How do I ameliorate this? How do I improve? If I'm a family member, if I'm a parent, or if I'm a spouse, or if I'm a nephew or uncle or whatever it is of a person who's experiencing addiction, what it would be me going too far? What would be me not doing enough? What would be me really pushing a person into these systems that aren't helpful? Or if I'm a friend, or, I think importantly, if I'm a clinician, somebody who's a professional who's supposed to be helping a person who has an addiction issue in their lives, what really is my role, and how do I stay client focused, and how do I keep from pushing a person?
Now, you are actually a coach in the Life Process program.
Yep.
So you have this job, A, and B, you have known some drug consumers in your personal life.
Yeah.
And so how do you start when somebody asks a question like that? What's your first round of reaction?
Push it back gently to the person and ask something like, inquisitively, curiously, I will ask, what do you think would happen if you or this person did absolutely nothing at all to change the situation? And I think that makes the person have to think. It doesn't actually lend itself to, do you think this person should get a therapist? That's like a really quick reaction. It actually makes the person think, well, okay, let me take a breath and think about, like, is tomorrow going to happen, kind of a thing. And, how severe is the situation? It forces people to sort of answer a lot of questions at once. So I start there.
Now, another way to react is, with all due respect, the person you're talking about hasn't called me up.
Right.
Called me up, or I'm talking to you. Right. So let's just talk about you for a minute. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with the person and why you're concerned, and tell me what you've tried so far. And let them speak about how they've been reacting to the person and what they've done, which hasn't been that successful. They're not happy about it, which in some ways is backing into where you're going. It's sort of saying, are you doing any more for this person than if you just left them alone?
Right.
Or if you said to them, why don't you call me if you feel I can be helpful? Or am I helpful to you about this situation? Am I in any way a positive impact on you? Um, could am I making it worse for you? Could I be more positive? You're saying let's open up the whole can of worms. We're saying that the whole 12-step model and the whole treatment universe, by the way, a lot more people are questioning that. At the same time that we flood people into it, are you on the whole right plane of where we should be going? Let's just explore that basic foundation.
Right. Like there's I like asking the question. I yes to everything you said. I like asking the question that I ask because, you know, the basis behind our book and our work is doing something is more than doing nothing. That idea is like actually you could really quickly screw things up. You know, especially if you know that people tend to move on past these blips, these anxieties. I think, as you put it, you know, your anxieties and your addictions are not a permanent stamp on your life. They're a thing that you encounter and experience, and you know, if you have the resources or you can muster the motivation, you move on from them. So leaving people alone sometimes, you could reason, actually would be helpful, because prodding at them, nagging them, or pushing them into something that's actually counterproductive, you're doing more harm than you're doing good. So the question is, I would like to, a lot of times people are asking, and there's a way I want to get into this, but a lot of times people are asking, I feel like I should be doing something for this person because I care about them. And it seems like they're being self-destructive. So what should I do? And I think I think that question actually means, what's the magic bullet? And I actually think it's disarming to tell people that there isn't one, because it verifies.
You say that to them, you know.
It validates the confusion, you know, the weird space that you're occupying, where you love a person and you think that they're not doing the right thing, they're not taking care of themselves, but you don't know exactly what to do. So I think the way I'd like to start it is, I wrote down a few key points. You can add to them if you want to, but some of the things that we talk about in our life process program, when it comes to a person who's coming to us with an addiction issue, the basic principles are: addiction's not all or nothing. People outgrow it. And it's more important, or I guess the important thing is exploring a person's overall life space, not the object or the thing or the involvement that an addiction, it seems to be centering on. Well, I'm quoting you. Recently, you shared a New Yorker article about how there are personalities that seem to be part of who people are, but when it comes to their narrative about their lives, it's a little bit more fluid. And you summarize and added to it, and a quote that I pulled from you is, "We are who we are, with consistent values and identity, but our addictions, anxieties, etc., are not part of this permanent package." So with that understanding, we listen to people and help them and figure out, all right, where are you now? Where would you like to be? How do we coast you that way? It's pretty commonsensical.
And do you ever have you ever had the feeling? I mean, another thing we do is we sort of say, what does the drug or thing do for them?
Right.
So are you ever in a situation where you're thinking, does this person need this addiction, or would they be worse off without the addiction, which is kind of a harm reduction concept?
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that all the time. I think optimistically when it comes to helping people, and I often have that idea, like, wow, all right, brother, you have a thing that actually helps. So instead of 0 things, you have 1 thing, and sometimes it causes you harm. So let's make it a few things. So you have a plethora of resources.
Can you give an example of somebody who had kind of an addiction and you were kind of like, well, let's go with that for a little while? Can you give any?
Drinking and pornography come to mind a lot, just because by virtue of the people that I interact with. Let's go with pornography. I mean, a lot of times it's people who are talking about having a relationship it's void of sex or void of attraction, and they want to be faithful to their partner. It's oftentimes men. They want to be faithful to their partner. There's just so much going on in life, and they feel like, oh, I'm using pornography all the time, and I'm hiding it, and I feel gross. And the thing about those people, I know other people though who are promiscuous and have sexual encounters with other people, and that opens up a whole variety of things that could be troublesome. And I kind of think about something like pornography is, okay, you found a passive thing to occupy that space until you find something else that is a better version of that's more, pro-social or, adaptive.
There's another example of that. There's something called, well, we're very aware of sexually aggressive behavior by men. That's a big thing now.
Yeah.
And then there's something, what is it called? Incel, involuntarily celibate men.
Yep.
And there are people who say only negative things about pornography. But then you might think that there are people who are using pornography as a way of avoiding that kind of a behavior.
Right.
I mean, there are a lot of people who are alone, and we would encourage them to try and have relationships and to do better in dealing with people. But in the meantime, they are alone. And that we're going beyond pornography now. And, we are in a position of saying to them, well, you're doing pretty good being content with yourself. You're doing as well as you can, having being somewhat isolated. You should accept who you are, and you should, maximize the kinds of things you're doing around that. And it's a self-acceptance is always number one.
So when somebody comes to us, let me reframe what I'm trying to do here, just in case I was too vague about it or spitting out too many words at once. I would like to come at this at the angle of, all right, what are we at LPP? We're talking about how to help people in a commonsensical way. And so let's take it from the core, a person experiencing addiction. I think that's what we're doing now, and how we might talk to a person like that. And then branch out to, if you're associated with this person, what could your role be? So we were talking about how we interact with somebody who has this experience. How can you speak to somebody in a way that lets them feel that, okay, you have problems, I've had problems, let's relax, let's take a breath and think about this, rationally. You're doing something that's productive given the resources that you have, or the skills that you have, or the ideas that you've come up with, or the values that you have claimed. So and we can move on from there. Let's see if we can reevaluate or think this through so that you can kind of build upon yourself so that you can get, trend a positive direction.
Now you're talking to the person with the bad habit, or
right. So that's like tier one is like, okay, there's a way that you might talk to a person with a bad habit, with a habit that they'd like to kick. And obviously you're not talking to a person with a habit that they'd like to kick unless they've in some way come to you and said, I want to improve this thing. But then the reason I wanted to do this is because I'm part of all these groups. I go on social media, I read articles, and there are these more questions than answers. The phenomenon where there's a book written, the more books that are written about a topic, the less people know about it, kind of a thing. So it seems like a mix of this. It's like a lot of books are written about this, and a lot of people are asking questions with no really answers, and they're spinning. Okay, so you're a family member or a friend of this person with a problem. And there are all different variations of what, I mean, and with different emphasis, like what you're supposed to do when you're in this situation is one way of thinking of it. Here's your role. Or there's another way of thinking about it that's like, what could you do, or what questions could you ask if you're a family member, or Is it okay to feel one way or another? So I'm interested in talking about that.
You, I mean, one phrase, I actually wrote a pamphlet for the Drug Policy Alliance that starts out by saying, don't panic.
Mm.
Would you say you're pretty good at not overreacting to people telling you when they're doing something bad? Did you feel that's a skill you have?
Yeah, I don't know where that came from precisely, but you're not going to tell me something that I'm going to gasp at. That's like I'll take that challenge.
And that's very good when you're dealing with children, you know what I mean? I was just having a conversation the other night with one of our colleagues. I don't know how much I can reveal. And when I think about children, you and I know, I have a keynote thing. The worst things that happen to people, they do to themselves. And so you've got to stop over worrying every possible danger that they face or that they can encounter. You have to loosen up, not panic, make sure that the worst things don't happen. But other than that, allow them to explore options that would otherwise make you really tense and anxious. So you must encounter that a lot with parents and children where they're super freaking out and you're kind of rowing in the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know one phrase you use I've seen worse.
Yeah, I don't say it to parents, but that's like a mantra that I think about. I've seen worse. In most cases I've seen worse, unless it's the worst case, and then that's still not panicking. But
and we don't, the person I'm talking about has an harm reduction attitude towards drugs with her children.
Mm-hmm.
And her sister has a son who died from drugs. And so I asked this person, do your sister know that you use drugs and that you don't, and you're okay with your kids using drugs, and how do they react? In other words, they could be thinking you're doing the greatest danger of all to them, your own kids. But what the idea we're trying to get across is that by lowering the bonfire, you're probably lowering the heat level, you're probably making it less likely that some giant conflagration will occur. And I think what she said to me was, they accept me. They know that I'm like that, but they're afraid to be that way themselves. You know, they can't let themselves unscrew themselves that way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think that if people can find that mindset, then they're better off. That's what I think. But at the same time, there are going to be people. You have to kind of do harm reduction with respect to naivete or like bad ideas. And so there are people who aren't interested in the harm reduction kind of approach who are still asking the question, what do I do for my family member? I'm thinking about parents for their kids. So in other words, but to be more precise and less abstract, I'm thinking about parents who haven't thought through what it means to have a harm reduction kind of approach, or letting kids have experiences, who maybe haven't read someone like Lenore Skenesi's book. They love their kids and they want to do something, and they also are aware that it would be easy to get them bumped into systems that aren't helping. So it's like, they've begun thinking about, well, I want to do more good than I do harm. I don't just want to kick the ball down the road and hopefully someone else's problem. No, this is my kid and I love them. The guy that I interviewed recently, his name is Mark Goulston. He's a psychiatrist and nowhere near as profound of a thinker as you are, and he doesn't break it down to the core level the way you do. But he's one of those guys that comes up with acronyms really well, stick with you, and they're pretty good. And one of them that he told me was HUVA, HUVA. And when you're having a conversation, you're a family member or a concerned person, there's almost no circumstance that you could not benefit from making sure that you're doing these things in the conversation. That H is hearing. You can ask yourself, did the person that I was talking to feel like I heard them? Understanding. Did the person who I was talking to feel that I understood them? Value. Did that person find the conversation with me valuable? And A is for added value. Did I add value to the conversation rather than detract from it? It's a very basic,
You actually shared a communication from a client, and he said, we teach a whole exercise where you help somebody, but you don't actually tell them anything. You just ask questions.
Right.
Just sort of where we're headed. And that guy wrote a note saying, it's changed my entire outlook on interacting with people. People have problems, and I think they have problems, but I no longer go in and think I have to come up with an answer or a solution. And instead, I engage them, which is what HUVA is, by asking them questions and listening to what they say and exploring their options. It's a whole, and that person who wrote that said, it's kind of changed my whole relationship to the world and to people.
Absolutely. HUVA is like the idiot's acronym for motivational interviewing or something like that. I don't mean to say it that way. I don't mean to be so pejorative. But yeah, motivational interviewing is the chapter that we teach. And it's saying you as a person engaging another person can actually, don't be so focused on changing the other person's frame that you don't put any effort into reframing what you're doing. And what you're doing could be actually drawing out of them the most rational aspects of what they're thinking, feeling, doing, experiencing, and want to do. And so, anyway, I think that's my best advice without knowing any specifics about a family member. When people ask those general questions, you've said before, it's kind of hard to play answer man if you don't know any of the specifics. But the best kind of theme I could suggest to people is, are you as a person engaging the person that you love or like or care about? Are you trying to bring the best out of them? Like if you're a parent, somebody is adult enough to have gotten into their problem. Someone is independent enough to have gotten into problems independent of your otherwise sage advice, if that's what you think you've given them. So, what makes you think that your sage advice is going to pull them out of the muck? Maybe it's something like helping them with a platform to figure out their own best thinking, which is actually a diametrically opposed to AA. Your own best thinking got you here. Actually, I think their own best thinking might draw them into some place that they want to be.
We should bring that out as another point of where AA gets people in problems. And one way you used to be able to do what you're saying is to say to people, your kid, when you're dealing with a person, they're going to have to go away and live their own life. You're not going to live their life. And one example you used to be able to use is, well, that's how you deal with children. Your job is not to let them live their life. They have to learn to do that on their own. But we're losing that model to a large extent. We're no longer thinking of children. We're trying to vouchsafe children into the future. You feel you're, let me put you on the spot. Are you pretty good on letting your daughter experience life with its downsides as well as its upsides? Do you have that gift in real life?
Yes, I think so. And not only that, but I feel that I've been gifted with an inquisitive, kind of free-spirited offspring. I know that she's 4, and so I understand that there's a lot of life left in her childhood that she could go one way or another. But the way that she's trending right now is that who's going to stop her from experiencing stuff that she wants to experience and she's so curious, inquisitive, and wants to know the ins and outs of things and what's right and wrong, that in some ways she's parenting herself and then asks us for advice about how to parent herself. That's what it feels like to me.
You did have a really good line. You were driving her somewhere and you passed where you're supposed to go, and you said, "Oh, let's do a loop." And now every time you go somewhere, she says, "Let's do a loop." And you're saying, "What's this about?" And then she says, "Well, I want to see new things, you know?"
Right. I thought that was like a neurotic thing. Like sometimes she thinks, oh, this is the way it is, so it needs to continue being this way. And my idea was, I'm going to pull her out of this way of thinking. I don't want her to get I don't want her to have this mindset that just because something is some way, it needs to stay that way. I thought maybe she was being rigid. And I said, so why do you like going on loops? What's going on with that? She said, well, I don't know. I just like seeing new things. And I said, what if we didn't go on a loop? She said, I don't know. We just get there and I'd still see new things. And that's like, okay. I don't know, you kind of passed the test.
She likes a loop. It's a way of saying, I want to see new things.
Yeah.
Now, I brought my grandson out to you. The single experience, do you know the single experience he had that he rushed home to tell his mother about? Can you imagine what that is?
Okay, tell me.
It was taking the, what are those boats called out into Lake?
Oh, the kayaks. Yeah.
And my daughter-in-law lets me take my grandson to Idaho and to Vermont. And I asked my own daughter, would you let me take a child somewhere? And she said no. And when we went out in the kayak, my grandson couldn't actually sit down in the kayak. He had to sit on his knees. And I'm so naive. I thought Lake Champlain, well, it's a lake. It's like Burnham Park Lake. Lake Champlain's like an ocean.
It's one of the deepest lakes in the country, yeah.
Can't see the other side.
Right.
And so he starts rowing out, and I started thinking, he's on his own, you know what I mean? I mean, there's nothing, you were out there in another boat, kayak. And when he got home, sometimes you don't realize he rushed out of the car to see his mother. And he said, I went out on a kayak into the lake. That was the biggest thing for him. And so that's so liberating, and to understand that and to recognize that. And my aunt, I mean, there's a certain amount of danger in life. Nobody wants their child to suffer those outcomes. But you and I know people whose children have died.
Yeah.
And they didn't die for the most part when they were 5 or 10. They get some later point, and they do something. That's such an important idea. They do something to themselves. And so for me, that's a way of unraveling. I honestly sometimes think, what a miracle. None of my children or grandchildren have died, and they've spent time with me doing things. It's almost like amazing to me, but for the most part, that's the way life works out. And there's no short tailing it, I mean, accidents happen. There's no way you can prevent them, but you can avoid. You want a person to respect. We talk about in Outgrowing Addiction, giving people values of being healthy, responsible, aware. Those are guardrails against negative things happening to them. And those guardrails, they own them, are the best guarantees that they're going to go forward in life.
Okay, so we've had, just to, this is so shorthand, but if you're a person experiencing an addiction and would like to improve, then our suggestion to start off with is, are you able to relax a second and think about how tomorrow is going to to happen. Today is okay. Tomorrow's going to happen. And it would maybe take minimal effort to get yourself trending in a positive direction. Can we start there and then move on? If you're a family member or friend, it's like you can actually relax in the sense that you're probably not causing this person to be in distress, but you could help if you don't try to do too much at once, and you think about what do you really want for the person, and can you help the person articulate themselves in a way that's helpful to them. I'd like to think that that's exactly how a clinician ought to operate. I mean, I do think that's how a clinician ought to operate. I think they have, just like a family member has this moral burden, like I'm supposed to be doing something. I'm a parent. I'm supposed to be teaching something or doing something, rather than letting my kid go out in the kayak in the middle of a deep lake. You're a clinician, and it's like there's a liability kind of flavor of that concern. You've interviewed Pat Denning and Jeannie Little, and one of the things you said to them was, I admire your courage to be able to say to people, to be able to say about yourselves, you had problems before you started talking to me. If I say, hey, do you want to continue drinking or do you want to continue doing drugs? And you're posing the question, you didn't do that to them. And maybe, in some cases you wonder, does the law see it that way? Does my boss see it that way? But logically speaking, you're not doing more harm by letting people talk it out. So do you have thoughts about, the clinician aspect? How do I help?
When I say another Jeannie Little and Pat Denning, I say, you guys are so brave. In other words, you have a client who's using a drug that everybody says they shouldn't use.
Right.
And you're saying to them, okay, you're using that drug and you've come here, and I want to make sure you're as well off as you can be, given who you are. You're open to so much. That person could have been headed in the worst possible direction. You could have helped them 100%, and they're still doing A, something wrong, and B, something bad could happen. But you're saying, okay, I could say, oh, you're doing something wrong, which is what AA says, and treatment, stop doing it. And then that doesn't happen 90% of the time. And you say, sayonara, I told you not to do it anymore. So I say, I think you guys are the bravest people in the world. And somehow, God willing, they've retired. They got through life without ever anybody arresting them or suing them. Oh my God, she's supposed to be helping them. And she knew they were taking painkillers, and she didn't, call the police or make them stop. She just tried to help them and make their lives better, which is so common. But let me give one other example. I was talking to a woman, and I've known several cases like this. I think regular old doctors are better at harm reduction than trained professionals.
Yeah, for sure.
And I know a couple of cases of oncology where women said, I'm not going to stop drinking. And the oncologist goes, I know one woman who was in her 70s, she's not going to stop drinking. What am I going to tell her? She's been drinking for the last 30 years. I say, well, why don't you limit yourself to just one drink of wine at night? You know what I mean? Instead of maybe 2 or 3. This isn't an addiction question. There's some finite, if small, risk for breast cancer with alcohol. And the oncologist is just like thinking, this lady's elderly. It's an important part of her life. I'm not going to recommend that she start drinking wine, but I'm not going to take something away from her that's really important to her, but maybe we'll be a little more mindful and cautious around it. And what you would say is, that's just a common sense. Any oncologist, I honestly believe all oncologists would do that.
Yeah, I rave about my doctor a lot in other ways, but one time It was kind of recently. My father was having some health issues, and my wife was having a few health issues, and there were a lot of things going on that was causing me anxiety. And I went into the doctor. I wound up having to do a stress test or an EKG because I started having these heart palpitations, and I was thinking, oh boy, is this genetic? Am I? And she reassured me and said, there's nothing really going on that I can see. Are you stressed? And I talked to her about it a little bit. And she's one of these people that, you're supposed to fit clients in 15 minutes, your patients at 15-minute slots, but she'll extend it because she wants to know what's going on. And so I told her a lot about it. She said, well, geez, like who wouldn't be stressed? And after a while we talked about it. And her advice to me, with the understanding that anxiety prolonged is pretty toxic. On the way out, she said, just sort of in passing, well, relax, have a beer tonight. And I don't know, have two just in case one for me, just in case I'm working. And that was like, that rolled off the tongue for her. And I think she was being serious, like relax.
The thing the doctors have is that they see 20 or 30 or however many ever people a day, and they see their whole lives, and they know they're not in charge of their lives.
Right.
They're sensible people. And they're under attack, doctors, for that. There's an article in the New York Times, I was discussing it with this other colleague, which says doctors gaslight women patients, minority patients, and then I got in there, elderly patients. Because they come in with some kind of a thing, and right. The doctor says, oh, well, that's not a thing. And so they're put in a way, somebody would put your doctor down for not doing an EKG and maybe a heart valve clearer. Who knows what they might do?
Right. And
so I find doctors more therapeutic than therapists myself. You know what I mean?
So how do we? Okay, I know that we're trying to keep these brief, and I have
go ahead.
I have not done a good job.
Along.
Brief. So this last point, a naive person, if I could put myself in that position, I can imagine I've never had an addiction issue. I think I can understand what we were just saying about someone having an addiction issue. I think I can understand what we're saying about a person who's a family member and concerned, and how to stay the course and level-headed and have some common sense. As a clinician, you talked about Pat and Jeannie as being so brave, but you can't have, and you're saying that you're the most brave people I know. You can't have the majority of clinicians needing to be the most brave people that you know in order to do their job in a commonsensical way. So what's the avenue towards doing that?
Well, this returns us a little bit back to the original. We're not Jesus Christ or God. We're not going to make things perfect. We don't know the answers. Things are not going to be all good or all bad. You're going to have to tolerate a certain amount of uncertainty with your grandson being out half a mile in Lake Champlain. You're just going to have to relax and let life happen. You're not in charge of the universe. And very much more often than not, things work out all right. I mean, I'm 76. I honestly sometimes just think, God, it's amazing I didn't die doing it. Well, you've had that experience too. Mm. It's almost as though the universe is trying to give you a break. You know what I mean? As long as you don't actually go out and kill yourself. And so your doctor's advice, relax and have a beer or smoke some marijuana. That's why they invented those things. So
there's a certain element of control that I think people want to have over either their own lives or other people's lives. This like their concepts they wish they could control, that if they were able to kind of pull back from that and steer themselves towards what's realistic and actually makes sense, even though that seems counterintuitive, like a finger trap you're supposed to push in so you can release. That's probably the most validating, freeing.
And we're going back to that, whatever it was, loofah or whatever it is.
Yeah.
The best thing you can do is interact with them in a positive, life encouraging way so that they'll come away having honed their own skills. And, you can't say, put on sunblock to an adult child.
Right.
You can
Right.
say,
Example.
do you know about that? Or do you use sun? Or are you aware that I've had, you can enter into that conversation with them and let them come away from it where they're going to come away from it.
Well, I think if we are, the thing that I could hope for is that we explain what we think, our rationale for behaving the way we do towards people we're trying to help. And if people are listening or watching and have those kinds of questions, maybe we didn't do a perfect job of answering the precise questions they have about their lives or their loved ones' lives, but maybe we added something to their thinking and maybe inspired
You
some
think
questions.
of your life as a little bit of an adventure? Is that a fair description of you?
Yeah. You?
Yes. I mean, I wake up in the morning and I say, wonder what the hell's going to happen today.
I
Going to have
really
to
do.
keep my eyes open. Going to have to be alert.
Yeah.
Something might happen. Maybe I'll do something new. But let's do something fun and different. Maybe even get in a little bit of trouble, not get arrested. It's I don't know if it's a part of Buddhism, but it's one of the values that we talk about. Seeing life as an adventure is a really positive orientation. Like your daughter saying, well, let's do a loop. That's an adventure.
Right. Or I remember your grandson saying to you, his question to you always when you interacted with them or you were going to pick him up from somewhere is, what adventure are we going to go on today? You got to have some sense of adventure in your life and some way of being able to be your own independent thinker. Okay, we'll end it there and we'll leave it at that. Thank you for entertaining us, Stanton.
Thank you for all the fun, Zach. Au revoir.